Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's edition of the Sunday Wire. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. We're streaming out live on the Alternate Current Radio Network and also at 21stCenturyWire.com. We're also streaming out live a special video edition on X, Twitter platform. We're also streaming out on YouTube, Rumble, and our Facebook page there at 21wire.tv. Thank you guys so much for joining us for this special broadcast. Really appreciate it. We've got a fantastic group of guests going to be joining us. We're going to be covering geopolitical hotspots. This is episode 495 of the Sunday Wire. Again, I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. Now, I want to welcome onto the stage. We're not going to take a break. We're going to go straight through on this format. I want to welcome to the stage another guest, a journalist, an international journalist, and his name is Chay Bowes. We're going to bring him up in a moment to the broadcast. I think we have him on the line right now. Chay, can you hear us okay?
Yeah, I can hear you fine, Patrick. Nice to see you.
It's great to see you as well, Chay. I mean, we had a sort of docket of stuff we wanted to get through, but I know you were listening in on this conversation that we had with the Yemeni diplomat, and I want to give you a chance to respond to what you heard, especially the position of Russia and other countries and how they're seeing this situation right now in the Red Sea. Go ahead, Chay.
Yeah, I mean, look, to anybody who's followed the Middle East, as I have done for, 25 years closely and read about it a lot, it's no surprise that it's Britain and the United States who are forming the backbone of this alliance, as they call it, which is a unilateral force. There's no mandate from any sort of international body to take the action that they've been taking whatsoever. And your previous guest is absolutely correct. It's also interesting to me that the British and Americans had no desire to take any action whatsoever in Yemen since 2015, where this brutal war has raged, the worst humanitarian catastrophe on earth at the moment. Well over 10,000 people killed in the fighting, but a terrible humanitarian catastrophe, as in children, women. And this, also has a thread back to the early 60s as well, 1962, I think it was. I haven't read about it for a while, but immediately I see the British in Yemen or British warships in Yemen. I think about the British project in Yemen. And the British got involved in Yemen in the 60s after the post-colonial period where they'd stirred things up. And we'll talk about that probably later on in the Middle East in a wider context, all beginning with Mohammad Mossadegh, the legitimate leader of Iran. In 54, I think he was overthrown in a coup, a terrible dirty tricks war by the CIA, MI6, and British Petroleum, I think, to overturn his government, his legitimate government, because he wanted to nationalize the oil in Iran, which some people, and I believe, was the sort of catalyst for all of the current instability in the Middle East. I mean, because of what happened to Mossadegh's government, the Shah of Iran was brought back in by the Western powers covertly. He was a brutal dictator, and he was overthrown then by the Islamic government. So this is the engine of this. But in Yemen in particular, the British were involved in a covert war in Yemen from the 60s because the king of Yemen died and his son took over. And this was a feudal state, very brutally managed. And al-Badr, I think, was the name of the king at the time. His son lasted a week and he was overthrown by a Yemeni army colonel, Salil, I think his name was. And he was an Arab nationalist. And remember, at that time in the early 60s, the Middle East, Arab nationalism was burgeoning. And this was all under the sort of wing, if you like, of Gamal Abdel Nasser, this great Arab leader who wanted to unite the Arabs, and this was by far the biggest threat to the British Empire at the time, as the British Empire crumbled in South Africa. And in the South, the British arch enemy at the time was Nasser, the Egyptian leader. And this led them to support a sort of a covert action to destabilize Yemen. So the British sort of project in Yemen goes back a long way. It's nothing new. So when people see British destroyers and American destroyers in the Red Sea, two things I'd suggest they should think. Where were they when this war began in 2015? Which many people, which I could easily tell you about the reasons why Yemen is so destabilized. Why is nobody calling out the British for supplying the weapons. The British RAF is complicit in war crimes in Yemen for bombing children. And it's the United Nations that says that, Patrick, not Chay Bowes or Patrick Henningsen or your previous guest. The United Nations has consistently tried to trace and track down the realities of the war. But nobody from the United Kingdom, particularly the RAF, who've supplied logistics, weapons, airburst bombs, all sorts of horrendous military assistance to the Saudi Arabians, actually, to perpetuate this war, which has its roots. These wars don't just erupt out of nowhere, no more than they did in Ireland, the division of my country, the occupation of the British, which led to a 30-year guerrilla war. It doesn't happen overnight. So the fact that the British and the Americans are the voluntary group who are now going to police the Red Sea all of a sudden to protect your microwave or your your coffee. We just want to protect international trade. It's absolute bullshit, excuse the French, in my view. This is about defending very lucrative lines of communication in the area into Israel. And remember, then we could talk all day and night about how the British are complicit in the creation of the actual state of Israel, from Sykes-Picot to the Balfour Declaration to these false promises to the Jewish population of Europe, pre-war, that they would give them a homeland if they helped lobby the Americans to come into the war. I mean, people should educate themselves as to what the rationales. None of the pieces on the geopolitical chessboard move without good reason. There's two realities. There's the reality that they peddle to their client media to say, we're defending you and the free flow of transit of goods through the Red Sea. And then there's the real reasons they're doing this, the real reasons. They're also showboating for the Saudis and for the Jordanians and for the UAE, because the Russians have increased exponentially their influence in the Middle East, in OPEC. So this is a chance for the United States and Britain to take, for Britain to take the few ships they have that actually work out of dock and sail along behind in the wake of their superpower friends, the United States. It makes no sense to me whatsoever what these ships are meant to do, sailing two basic fleets into the Red Sea when October 7th happened, which is bizarre. But what is, pretty putrid to me is, where has this concern been when Israel has been committing a genocide in Gaza? There was no dispatch of any resources to even call for a ceasefire. Everybody sat back and said, well, that's fine. So it seems patently obvious to me that when your allies want to perpetuate a genocide, as Britain and America, their ally in the Middle East, their stationary aircraft carrier is Israel. They helped create that state. The United States has given $250 billion plus in military aid to a very wealthy country since its inception in 1948, I think. $250 billion it's given in military aid. And remember, a lot of that military aid went into fighting several of the wars, the 6 Days War, the Yom Kippur War, and various other wars where Israel, after being attacked by its Arab neighbors, no doubt, annexed territory. And, annexing territory is very current. When Russia decides to go into Crimea to protect a Russian population, and the Americans accept that the population of Crimea is overwhelmingly Russian. Many of their State Department reports have said it. Everybody knows that. But when Russia goes in there to protect it from a coup d'etat in Ukraine, in Western Ukraine, where the CIA, we absolutely know, Victoria Nuland, Jeffrey Pike, we actually heard her say it, they overthrew a legitimately elected government. So this is like a theater. It's like a farce. On one hand, you have America saying that they're going to protect the world from destabilizing influences. They're going to defend democracy and the mandate of democracy. So that's unless that mandate is in Crimea, where most people want to be Russian and be under the care and protection of Russia. And they knew that. They've written it in many of dozens of State Department journals. I can list them for you.
And there was a referendum in Crimea, wasn't there, Shay? It was quite an overwhelming referendum, if I'm not mistaken.
Absolutely. And it's also important to know that
more than 90%.
When people say, Crimea is Ukraine, well, I often say to them, well, what was Crimea in 1953? It was in Russia. It was Russian because it was Nikita Khrushchev himself, with very significant Ukrainian links, basically gifted Crimea to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in an argument over grain prices. He said, well, look, you can have administrative control, but the Russian Navy stayed exactly where they were in Sevastopol and in the fleet headquarters. So this drive-through narrative that the American client media would like to give our listeners about how everything begins on a certain day. Everything began in February 2022 when the Russians intervened in Ukraine militarily. Great powers don't take dramatic actions like that without good reason. You can look back to the Munich Security Conference in 2007 when Vladimir Putin very clearly said, you're pushing us too far. The Americans understood that. They knew that. Great, much brighter people than me, Stephen Cohen, Professor John Mearsheimer, Noam Chomsky, have been pointing out the inevitability of a conflict with Russia if NATO continued to encroach on Russian interests and territory. No more than America would tolerate Russian or Chinese forces overthrowing a legitimate government in Mexico, even if it was corrupt, and then creating a large Russian-Chinese-backed army of 250,000 men over 10 years, terrorizing and victimizing Americans, cultural Americans or ethnic Americans and banning the English language. Do you think the United States would have tolerated that for a month? The 82nd Airborne would have been in Mexico City. And this is the reality of great power politics and realist politics. But what's peddled to the media through the client media, who is exceptionally controlled, as we know, and we don't just make that up. We don't guess that the client media is controlled. We know from things like Operation Mockingbird, where the CIA controlled hundreds and hundreds of journalists directly to peddle a narrative of fear about the Soviet Union, fear about the Chinese, fear about even, black groups in America. So we need to step back and look at the chessboard and say, why are the British and the Americans now trying to flex their muscles in Yemen? And it's completely obvious to me that it's a signal to their electorates. It's a very opportune time for America, particularly, and Rishi Sunak, where food banks seem to be the only growth area in Britain right now. It's very opportune to embark on what they would like to suggest is some kind of Falklands deployment. We're going to go and secure freedom of navigation of the seas in an area where they've completely ignored while they supplied weapons to kill thousands and thousands of children, cause a famine in an area which they basically stirred up the problems in the first place. I mean, when you think about the complicity of the British in the creation of the crisis in British Palestine, and the creation and looking the other way when it comes to UN mandates regarding Israel, when you think of the complicity of both of these players, the fact that they would suggest that they're going to now walk into the neighborhood and save the people that they threw in the water, basically, it's absolutely ludicrous, Patrick. I think people really need to move away from October 7th, move away from dates and reverse back. And it's easy to do. It's all the information is out there. People like you, people like me, we write about it. We're trying to tell people, see the bigger picture. Nothing arrives by accident when this happens. And there's a big game being played right now on the global stage. Russia and China are allied together now. It's an almost, I find it very difficult to see how that alliance will be fractured or go any way other than to increase and strengthen. And this really undermines, American hegemony, and America's most enthusiastic volunteer police officer when it comes to U.S. hegemony is, of course, the United Kingdom, an almost irrelevant global force now in many ways, which will take any opportunity it can to exercise this faux importance on a world stage. The reality is that if they were actually wanted to engage, as in Ukraine, and we saw Boris Johnson being dispatched to Ukraine to make sure there wasn't a peace deal, to encourage Vladimir Zelensky to ban peace negotiations with Russia. And this all happens in the midst of a terrible domestic crisis for Boris Johnson, who's been accused of being a liar, of basically misappropriating state funds, all of which turned out to be true. He had to resign. It's the same for Biden. It's the same for Sunak. Very unpopular people. Joe Biden, almost a laughable, incompetent man. It's almost shameful how he's being led around reading from notes. So it's not an accident that these faux conflicts that they create the problem, then they deploy themselves to solve the problem. And it's all very convenient because domestically, Joe Biden's in a huge amount of trouble. There's no way Joe Biden is going to win an election against Donald Trump. I don't think anybody can convince themselves that this man is capable of even finding his way home if he got lost in a shopping center. Forget about winning an election against a very acerbic, very smart, very tuned in Donald Trump, who's telling people, I'm going to solve the problems. I'm going to get these guys around the table. And what Trump is doing, I think, just to add a bit of note about Trump, I think what's so attractive about Trump, I disagree with Trump on some issues, but I do agree with him that this isn't that complicated. It's not that complicated. Get them around the table, sit down and say, what do you want? What do you want? Do a negotiation. Negotiation is basic. Arguing over your neighbor over a tree, hanging over a wall. There is a way through. We found it in Ireland. People who said they would rather drown in each other's blood than sit in the same room. We did a deal. We ended the fighting. Now, it isn't perfect, but nobody's dying now. It can be done. If we can sit down with the British and their proxies in the north and come to an agreement on this island after, thousands of years, basically, of conflict, it can be done. It can be done in Palestine. A just peace can be reached, but there is no money in a just peace, Patrick. There's no military-industrial complex. There's no political grandstanding and showboating. You don't get to dispatch your fleet to distract from the catastrophic state of your economy, as what's happened in Europe and the wider sort of global economy since these idiotic self-inflicted self-harm sanctions against Russia. So I just urge people to see the bigger picture, see it as a chessboard, step back and try to understand, why would they do this? What's the history? What's Britain's involvement in Palestine and in Yemen? And why is America here? America has invested so much in Israel. I mean, of course, then you got the Zionist lobby in Israel, exceptionally powerful in the media, exceptionally powerful lobby politically. We're coming into an election year. Joe Biden doesn't want to alienate the Zionist lobby. Think about it. Joe Biden very famously said, if Israel didn't exist, I'd have to create it. I'd want to create it. He's declared himself as a Zionist, and this is purely for political ends. And in the middle of this, ordinary, very poor, geostrategically insignificant people die, like the people in Yemen and like the people in Palestine. And similarly, the people of Eastern Ukraine. Today, over 20 people were blown to pieces by NATO artillery in a market. And we've got very mentally ill people on Twitter I've just seen denying that this attack even happened and then saying that it was Russia bombing itself yet again. So this is the kind of toxic environment that mainstream media creates by lying to the general public by omission. And this is a key element of how they deploy their truth. This will never be reported. The reality of the background in Yemen will never be reported. Like 4,000 children starving to death. Saudi bombers facilitated and maintained by the Royal Air Force, bombing this civilian population since 2015, essentially, the complicity, after trying to overturn the country. Grant Shapps today also said, I think I saw a video of him saying, we don't interfere in people's. I mean, you serious? A British Minister of Foreign Affairs or Minister of Defence saying we don't interfere. The British only interfere because they're a post-empire, post-colonial power, and the British are desperate to become relevant again after Brexit. So I just urge people, don't take the drive-through narrative. It's always tasty. Like drive-through food, it's very tasty. It's easy to eat. It tastes good. You just grab it, you say, good guy, bad guy, and you keep driving. You wind up the window and you throw the bag in the back. Just like food, to actually get your head around what's going on globally, you do need to do a bit of research. You do need to go and buy the ingredients. You got to cook it yourself, and then but it's going to taste much better than this shit you eat when you go through the drive-through. So I'd urge people to see the background, see it as a big chessboard, and then they'll very quickly be able to see what's really happening in Yemen and in Palestine.
That was almost a plug for Just Tasty Period, the new fast food chain in Russia.
Вкусно и точка.
Yeah.
Вкусно и точка. Tasty, and that's it.
That's it. Yeah, formerly McDonald's. So great Great exit by McDonald's there. No, Shay, seriously, October 7th, history began on October 7th. Total gaslighting. February 25th, 2022, nothing happened before that. 9/11, nothing happened before that, etc. That's the exercise. And I want to bring this because you shared this to me with me offline. And you just mentioned it, okay? And I want to say something quite controversial, how I'm going to frame this. I want to get your comment on whether you think I'm so far off the ledge on my comment. But let's bring this story up on stage. At least 18 killed in Ukrainian strikes in Russian-controlled Donetsk. I mean, just forget about the CNN propaganda framing on that. But the point is, civilians are still being targeted in Donetsk, in the Donbass, and they haven't not been targeted. It's been going on for 8 years, Shay. So a Palestinian said to me a few months ago, they said, well, what's the difference between, well, Gaza is obviously worse in terms of the magnitude of this slaughter, but the people in Donetsk have been hammered from the air by Ukraine for 8 years. They said the difference is we don't have a Russia coming to rescue us in Gaza. That's a pretty strong statement there. But just objectively looking at the dynamics of those two situations.
Well, I don't think that's too strong at all. I mean, living in Moscow, living and traveling across Russia for the last year, and meeting the Russian people, living, eating, working, traveling with them, immersed in this Russian culture, if you like. Russians are quite conservative overtly, they're quite quiet in public places. But when you start to talk to them and understand the people of Donetsk, Lugansk, and these republics, these new territories, as they're known in Russia, or returning territories, I heard a Russian guy call them the other day. He said the returning territories, meaning they were ours and they are ours. They always were ours. He suggested that, people were hoping that this Russian intervention would have happened in 2014. They saw what happened in Crimea, a completely bloodless intervention by Russia into a completely Russian population. People came out and welcomed them. It's very difficult to portray, as the Western media does, this full-scale invasion in 2014 of Crimea. It's an absolute fantasy and fallacy. Most of the Ukrainian army deserted and went over to the Russian side, Patrick. And this is another thing that is not really well known in the West. When the Maidan coup happened, and this triggered a civil war. I mean, any demographic map you want to look at going back 30 years will show you the schism between East and West Ukraine, between the industrial heartland in the East and the, pro-European West, radically nationalist West. Of course, most of those territories, and a lot of them were previously territories of Hungary, Poland, and Romania. So again, zoom out from the chessboard and get your head around the reality. This fantasy narrative, this think tank delusion that Vladimir Putin woke up and said, okay, I'm going to stick a pin in a map. Where will I pick? Let's do Ukraine. Boom. Let's just invade somebody. Is absolutely ludicrous. Vladimir Putin is an exceptionally shrewd, exceptionally well-educated, probably the most competent statesman on the world stage today, I'd suggest. Not a manic lunatic looking for war. Absolutely not. He was totally aware of the damaging prospect of engaging in war, and he still is. And I don't believe Putin wants this war particularly. I don't believe anyone in this in the higher echelons of the Russian government wants the war. I don't think anyone here wanted the war, and that's my opinion. I don't know, but this is my opinion of talking to people. No one wants it, but now at this stage, nearly 2 years in, they know how it has to end, and there's absolutely no ambiguity about that now here in Russia, because people are now confident. They see that the whole sanction thing doesn't touch them. It's utterly irrelevant other than travel. So, anyone who comes here immediately goes, Jesus, this is a giant farce. This is a totally functioning, open, liberal, normal society. So when you see, when you meet people from the Donbass and you talk to them, their first view is, we wish you should have come sooner. why didn't you come sooner? So they're not too fawning over the Russians. Say, well, you should have come sooner. We were on our own. We were fighting alone. And that dispels another myth that the Russian army invaded and assisted them. If the Russian army had invaded Ukraine in 2014, it would have been utterly destroyed because there was no Ukrainian army. It was a post-Soviet wreck of an army. The army that fought Russia and has again been defeated probably several times since February 2022 by the Russian army, it's probably been defeated twice, was a 250,000 man NATO-trained army created post-Maidan by NATO. Ukraine is the de facto NATO state. It's like a mistress. It gets, it gets the trips abroad. It gets the gifts. It doesn't get the wedding ring. And conversely, it doesn't get the benefits of the wedding ring because as the divorce occurs now, it's being treated as a nobody. You're just somebody I used to know. As the West tried to compile reasons to pull out of Ukraine, the Ukraine needs to reassess what is victory. Ukraine didn't listen. They drove our tanks onto the minefields. They should have walked onto them. Yesterday, I saw Dmytro Kuleba, this quite repulsive character, talking in Davos, saying, "Look, we're offering the best deal on the international market for war right now. You get to keep your most precious resource, which is your soldiers. We kill ours. Just give us the weapons and the money." Can you imagine somebody saying that about their own people? Can you imagine the European Union? Ursula von der Leyen.
Shay, that's drifting into Maria Antoinette territory there for Kuleva. I mean, it's really insane, bad,
right? Yeah. So what we see right now is a huge awareness in Russia. Dare I say it, the political awareness and education in Russia is higher than certainly higher than the United States and higher than most countries in the European Union. Russian people tend to be, most Russians will start a conversation with, like, I don't want to talk about politics. And 2 hours later, they'll have educated you in great detail about every element of a certain subject. And that could happen in a supermarket, in a bar, on a bus, anywhere. So I think the Russians have learned two things from this conflict. Firstly, that they've realized, well, you know what, we're tougher than we thought. We thought we wouldn't be able to survive this. We thought we had to go on our foreign holidays to Europe. We thought that this would be tougher. And people do become more confident as they see that they can stay on the field. Russia is, as anybody knows from the West who's traveled here, is a highly functioning, very enjoyable, very wealthy country with everything you need to live in absolute comfort here. It's a very stable country socially. It has totally refused to take the pill regarding the woke agenda, this woke mafia that seems to have infiltrated every element of our lives, from educating our kids to deciding, you can become a sheep overnight, all this utterly ridiculous drivel, which again is used as a deflection from failed politicians in the West. They say, well, two men can get married, two dogs and cats can get married and have a kitten. Whatever you want, you can do all of that stuff. The individual has become central to everything regarding political success, while the whole state collapses, the economy collapses. We end up in these ridiculous, endless wars with people we've never even met. Most of our people don't even know where the countries are. So this is all about the deflection of failed politics, in my view. And in Russia, people have just refused to do that. In Russia, you can do anything you want in your private time. You can be gay, you can be straight, you can be trans, you can do anything you like. But the state isn't going to advocate on behalf of any particular ideology, and certainly not going to allow it to become politicized to manipulate one or other group in society. That's it in Russia. You can say what you want. There's nobody here that doesn't have an opinion, including I disagree with Putin. I mean, you can get in a taxi and say, what do you reckon? Say, the war's bad. I don't like the war. Putin's useless. He's very, very much, the majority will say, we have a strong president. We need a strong president. Very much the majority will say, the war is terrible, but it's necessary. We don't want our kids to fight this war. We have to go all the way to Odessa. A lot of people. So there is a huge difference in opinion, healthy debate. And anything else that you hear in the West, as most of our listeners are from, is absolute fantasy and fallacy. And it's deployed by the same media who told you, Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. The same media who hasn't been able to tell us how Hamas managed to send 1,000 heavily armed fighters through the most defended border on earth. over a period of 6 hours, how they managed to send 1,000 fighters flying, burrowing, blowing holes in this fence, the most surveilled fence on earth. How did Hamas manage to do that? Kill 1,200 people and then carry 200 or 300 back through the same holes in the fence. And nobody noticed. Nobody seemed to know. I mean, I wonder why the Western media isn't asking those questions, Patrick. I mean, if we want to talk about a conspiracy and be called conspiracy theorists, nobody's still been able to show me any evidence as to how the Mossad, the Air Force, the border guards, the Israeli army, this much vaunted greatest army that ever took to the field on earth, how come everybody was on a day off on the October 7th?
Well, that's a good question. It also begs the possibility of what you just said, is that they're much vaunted as a force, but maybe not as good and not as efficient, not as professional, and not as effective in their so-called deterrent strategy as many assumed they were over these last years. They've slumbered a bit in recent years because they have overwhelming force. But that brings us on to the topic of Gaza. I wanted to get your opinion on. I know you've made a lot of historical comparisons to the Irish armed struggle, liberation struggle, and other armed liberation struggles in South Africa. You've covered a lot of these different things in your reporting. So let's put Palestine and Gaza and Hamas into historical perspective. How would you do that in order to compare to past armed struggles? Because this is the problem, Shay. A few governments have labeled Hezbollah or Hamas as terrorist organizations. They get the political designation, and then no more discussion. No more discussion. Can't have any discussion about history, about the intricacies of the situation, of who's wrong, who's in the wrong, who's in the right. Can't have any of that discussion. It's a terrorist organization, and therefore, ergo, Shay, we can do whatever we need to do, says Israel, to eliminate this terrorist threat to the state of Israel. Put that into historical perspective, and maybe, if you will, perhaps correct the perspective.
Yeah, I think, again, I know I keep harping on at this thing. You got to look back into historical context. When for example, in Ireland, when I grew up, I was born in 71, the war had just started in Ireland, the war in the north of Ireland. It had been bubbling along, civil war, the revolution in 1916, the Free State was formed. But there was relative peace. But in 69, basically the armed struggle began in the north when the civil rights movement was crushed by the British. The British created an orange statelet, which had its own parliament, which was an apartheid statelet against Catholic Irish people. This was in the 1960s, imagine. And again, the British were preoccupied with much of their collapsing empire in Africa, in Kenya, the Mau Mau, in Yemen, in Aden. My own father was in the British Army. He was in the Irish Guards. He was a guardsman in the Irish Guards, and he experienced this. He often tells me that when he was told that they were going to Aden, actually, they were going to Cyprus or Aden, just shoot them. Just shoot them. Just shoot them first, because you won't get to ask them a second time. You see somebody you don't like the look of it, just shoot them. And this is in the 60s. This is the colonial attitude. And my own father told me this. So when you look at who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, it's who appoints them as such. Okay, look at South America. Look at how the United States deployed its vast wealth and power in South America from the 50s right up until the 90s, funding people like Noriega, funding the Contras, funding the most pernicious groups while telling everybody, that these were fighting against the scourge of communism. Okay, so these weren't terrorists to the Americans; they were freedom fighters. One of the most interesting comparisons, Patrick, is, of course, the Taliban. When the Taliban were fighting the Soviet Union, the Taliban were the most, I can show you the most, glowing and fawning articles in the American media about these rugged, good-looking men, these Peshmerga fight, these men coming down from the hills to fight.
The Mujahideen, the brave Mujahideen.
Yeah. So these were the warriors of God. These were great men fighting the Russians with American Stinger missiles, of course. So here's your answer. This is why Hamas is a terrorist group to the Americans. And this is why the Houthis are now a terrorist group. Back when I was a kid, all the money, most of the money for the weapons that the IRA bought from Muammar Gaddafi, because Gaddafi supported the IRA, another African nationalist, another incredible character, interesting man who met a gruesome end thanks to Hillary Clinton's looking the other way and working with terrorists in Libya, as they worked with terrorists in Syria, Al-Nusra Front. You know, we've got very famous emails from Jake Sullivan saying, you know, Al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda are on our side in Syria. I mean, so again, people need to get their heads around this. This is a chess game. This is a game. The American State Department and the White House don't care who Al-Nusra killed. They don't care who Al-Qaeda killed. They don't care who anybody kills once it's the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Once they view it as an asset to be deployed. Currently, Hamas is an asset which is being deployed against Israel. And therefore, it will be declared a terrorist group. Remember, the Americans and the Japanese and several governments declared the Azov Battalion, who America now funds with high-tech weaponry in Ukraine, a group of people founded by a guy called Andrei Bieletsky, a hateful Nazi and racist. Their wages are paid today by American taxpayers. As soon as the Russian intervention happened in February 2022, the Japanese government immediately rode back on their decision to define them as terrorists. The whole grimy nexus between Nazism and nationalism, which goes back to American attempts to destabilize the Ukrainian SSR post-war, Operation Red Sox, Operation Aerodynamic, where most of the agents dropped into Ukraine were killed by the Russians. It was a catastrophe, but they funded people like Stepan Bandera. They gave him refuge in Germany. This man was complicit in the massacre of hundreds of thousands of Jews, Poles, Gypsies, and ethnic Russians. And you can read about this in universities in Ukraine. That man has hundreds of monuments in his name. They named streets after him. They named the 1st of January, his birthday, as a national holiday. He's on postage stamps in Ukraine. This is what the United States is willing to fund while its proxy, Ukraine, is trying to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. They will do the same. The Americans don't care about the people in Taiwan. They have absolutely zero interest in democracy, in the people in Taiwan, in Ukraine. If the Americans cared about democracy in Ukraine, there would have been an election. There hasn't been an election. In 2019, the US State Department clearly stated that Ukraine was a failed state, that there was extrajudicial killing, that the police were, exceptionally corrupt, that prisoner torture was commonplace. And that's, talking about Pearl Gonzalo Lira, what happened to him. The Americans knew about this. So it's about who decides the good guys and the bad guys are. And again, if tomorrow the Houthis decided that they were going to work with the Saudis and with the Americans and the British to do the bidding of Uncle Sam or Rishi Sunak in the region, they would soon fall off the register of terrorist organizations, just as Hamas will. If Hamas will become the Palestinian Authority, if Hamas will stop resisting this brutal occupation and genocide now, and this displacement and this punitive attack, if Hamas will stop doing that, they would find themselves immediately much like the Palestinian Authority, like Fatah, which is essentially a client state, a free state within Palestine, which is exceptionally corrupt, exceptionally infiltrated. As Hamas, I mean, we were told prior to October 7th that Hamas was exceptionally infiltrated by Mossad. How come they didn't see them manufacturing 5,000 missiles? How come they didn't see them building the launchers? And how come they didn't see them coming across the fence, Patrick? It's a little stone in my shoe, and I'm writing about it at the moment. But again, it always helps to zoom out and understand who's declaring them as terrorist, a terrorist organization. Surely the terrorist organization is the one that's massacring thousands of civilians in weeks. Surely the terrorist organization is the one who facilitates the dropping of airburst munitions onto children in Yemen. the RAF, surely is that not terrorism? But the difference is who gets to declare them terrorists? As you very interestingly said to our Yemeni guest, you're basically putting sanctions on these guys and you're acting out that mandate. You said we're going to sanction them. We're not letting their shipping come through. So when Yemen says that, that's terrorism. When Israel murders thousands and thousands of innocent children, bombs hospitals, strafes fleeing refugees, attacks churches, mosques, murders people, that's not terrorism. That's self-defense, Patrick. So again, let's get our heads around who is writing the script here and who's sort of peddling that script out to the wider public. Unfortunately, most people consume this drive-through narrative via the mainstream media, and it's changing. And platforms like yours fantastically give voices like mine a chance to say what we're saying here, and thankfully we can do that. And it's shifting somewhat, I think, because it's impossible in the age of instant news and imagery to deny what's happening in Israel. Can you imagine this happening in the 1960s or 50s? Nobody would even know it was happening, just as nobody knew what Britain's crimes of empire were in Kenya, in South Africa, in Ireland. I mean, can you imagine the cries and screams that were never heard prior to individuals being able to take a film? It's a chilling thought to see how these guys behaved before. Because remember, there's only one country on earth who's ever deployed a nuclear weapon in war. There's only two great empires that have killed tens of millions of people. Since the Second World War, the United States has killed over 10 million civilians in dozens of wars, coups, targeted assassinations. They've overthrown governments. The British and the Americans are the two great empires of occupation, destruction, and theft in modern history. And it just so happens that they are now the two great policemen of the world. The United States decides who gets to have a nuclear weapon after being the only country that's ever used one. What does that tell you? So this is about understanding, when possession is 9/10 of the law, when you exert massive influence, even in criminal courts of justice. When the ICJ said it was going to investigate war crimes in Iraq and may indict American citizens, the Americans actually said, if you try to do that, we'll bomb your court. People have to hear that. We'll bomb your court. Yeah. Okay. So that's that then. That's quite obvious. Any country that wants to, assist anyone dissenting from the United States narrative is going to get bombed. They're either going to get bombed, or there'll be a coup, or worse, they will crush their economy with the debt-based dollar, which they've been doing for hundreds of years, basically. This is how they've controlled post-colonial Africa. When the British moved out, the Americans moved in with the dollar to prevent any national unity. They killed people like, they destroyed Nasser, they destroyed Gaddafi, who wanted a gold-based currency for Africa. He ran, he had an incredible social welfare system. He banned mortgages. He banned interest on mortgages for young families. The man was a very innovative man, of course, portrayed as a monster in the West. But you got to ask yourself, why did they portray this man as a monster? Why are they portraying the Houthis as a terrorist? And why are they portraying Hamas as the terrorists? If the Israelis hadn't seized the Palestinian territory in such a brutal way and dehumanized them, the October the 7th would have never happened. The IRA would have never existed without the British-sponsored apartheid in my country. It would never have existed. And likewise, most of the resistance groups on earth that are, declared terrorists by the American empire wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the real terror, the real terrorists doing their work. And when you control the global currency, you just can't escape this. So I think, again, it's about looking at the bigger picture, see it for what it is. When they write the rules, it's the American rules-based order. And I came up with this one the other day. The international rules-based order is basically America makes the rules and America gives the orders.
That's it. Yeah, you're the first person to explain that in one sentence, basically. I'll add a couple to that. By the way, international law backs armed liberation struggles under occupation by any means necessary, and that's upheld by the international courts of justice as well. So that's the Palestinians and even the Russian representative to the United Nations, Polyansky, articulated this point as well that they do have the right to defend themselves if they're being occupied. The occupiers, however, are in a much more precarious position. They do not have the right to, quote, self-defense if they are illegally occupying. And that is the conundrum from international law perspective that Israel falls into. So I'll add to your list, which we could expand that list out. You're talking about those hypocritical narratives in history. Vichy France. Do you know France has not designated Hezbollah as a terrorist organization? Because if they do, politically, they have to condemn the French resistance in Vichy France, who the Nazis called a terrorist organization.
Yeah, well, of course. In Europe at the moment, and I did a piece on this, which I tweeted a small little film on it. They've just had a big court case in Italy about the fascist salute, the Roman salute, the Sieg Heil salute. It's the brand, right? So they've basically said, but it's not really illegal to do it unless you're doing it because you hate black people or you're a Nazi. So that means you can walk down the street in Italy now doing the famous Roman salute. I'm not going to do it because some Ukrainian will screen grab it and, I'll be called a Nazi. So, as they do. So, I mean, this is the reality now in Europe. I mean, and it's very difficult for European countries to condemn displays of Nazism, fascism, this brutal ideology when they're funding it in Ukraine. And they are funding it in Ukraine. They're funding a radical nationalist government there who has, openly adopted remembrance, celebration, and the sort of the elevation of people like Roman Shukevich, Stepan Bandera, and these innumerable, the Nachtigall battalions, the Galician division of the SS, which was comprised solely of Ukrainian volunteers. So all of this is fine now. They were just a bit misunderstood, Patrick, the Nazis. They weren't really that bad. We should have just let them deal with the Russians and everything would be fine. I mean, this is the kind of attitude you see now, particularly in the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, these highly aggressive people. They recently deported an 82-year-old man for speaking Russian and voicing his views. You don't get free speech. This machine that purports to be defending free speech is the most, insipid and dangerous threat to free speech we've seen since Nazism, in my view. That's my view, my absolute view. In my own country, hate speech laws that will criminalize you having anything on any device that could be construed by a court as offensive or hateful. Anything. So if you have a documentary on your phone about the SS, as a historian or someone who studied history like me, because you're writing about it, and the police come to my house, they can seize my phone, my wife's phone, my children's phone, all our computers, take me to a court and say, this is hateful. And I hadn't spread it anywhere, nothing. It's the most draconian, Orwellian, dangerous law, I think, in our constitutional history as an independent state.
Isn't this the same? Is this not the same totalitarianism that the West decried and derided the Soviet Union for, and then waged a Cold War over? Is it not the same thing?
Well, as you know, Patrick, the West, the collective West, has become the Soviet Union without the free healthcare, without the free holidays, without the big space program, and without the transport system that works, and the cheap food, cheap free medicine. I mean, where will I stop? So the West has become the Soviet Union without all the good bits. It is the Soviet Union, but the transport systems collapsed, the economies are in shit, the socially we're in big trouble, a lot of violence, more weapons than human beings in the United States, guns killing more children in the United States than cancer every year. And what is America doing? It's spending trillions of dollars on wars it probably helped start. So I'm going to show you a trick. I'm going to stick a knife in you, and I'm going to pull it out, and then I'm going to stitch it all up and bandage you up, and you're going to thank me for it for the rest of your life. And if you ever ask anyone else for an opinion, I'm going to stick it back in. Then I'll pull it out. So this is the insanity of this neo-conservative hegemony, which is peddled around the world by the United States and eagerly followed by the poodles in London. It's just remarkable.
And talk about historical revisionism. I know we had spoken about when this story sort of crept up. I'm going to put an article here from the Bild newspaper, and this was previously a memorial to Dresden. I got a couple of before and after pictures here. Let me give you the before picture there, Shay. There's an inscription there. It's got it basically, showing respect to the victims of the firebombing of Dresden during World War II. And here's the after picture, Shay. And I know you're one of the first people to flag this up. There's no more inscription, Shay. It's gone. It's been sandblasted. Now, I know there's some explanations as to why this might be, but it is kind of harrowing if you think about it. But your comment on that one.
I mean, look, you and I kind of collaborated a little bit on this when it first came up. We had discussions saying, could this be real? Could it happen? We were looking for sources to verify it, as we try to make sure before we share anything or comment on it that it's real. I thought it may be photoshopped. I couldn't believe that in Germany, a country which is so racked and directed by its collective guilt about the war, the Second World War, in a very negative way and in some positive ways, of course. I couldn't believe that it was real. But then very quickly we found out it was real, and you and I kind of hemmed and hawed, should we take it down? Should we do it? But it was real. Of course it was real. They sandblasted this memorial. What's fascinating is what the memorial was about. And it's about, the memorial marks the place where a pyre was built on which over 6,000 civilian bodies were disposed of, burnt, after the Allied firebombing of Dresden in 1945. Now, there's a huge debate as to whether Dresden had any military significance whatsoever. There's a huge debate as to whether this was warranted. Of course, the killing of, I think 25,000 civilians in 3 days, is that ever justified? Is that ever justified? I mean, I know the Israelis are now justifying it by saying, well, there's no innocent Palestinians. And I've recently posted as well. I said, well, there was a time when people said there was no innocent Jews. And the same ideology spurred the most grotesque demonstration of inhumanity in living history, the Holocaust of the Jews. But here we see the Germans very insipidly and creepily sort of trying to wipe history out. We don't want to remember this because this was done by our best friends now, okay? So our best friends, firebombed one of the most ancient cities in Europe, destroying immeasurable historic buildings. Remember, the Nazis never bombed Paris, Patrick, strangely. But the Allies bombed Dresden and they wiped it out. They destroyed the city completely, killing tens of thousands of civilians. It was said, and British troops said, and British commentators said at the time, that it was an unnecessary target. This was a signal to the Soviet Union. As many scholars would suggest, that bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki was a signal to the Soviet Union and to the world that America is a nuclear power. And there's no better way to show that than to save American troops, of course, because a land invasion of the Japanese islands would have been very costly. But the Japanese were defeated. You could have put a blockade around Japan and they would have had no impact. You could have just hemmed them in until they said, okay, we quit. But developing this weapon, which was due to be used against the Germans, and then the war ends and everyone's worried about the Russians. The Russians look pretty tough, don't they? They accounted for, remember, the Red Army, the Soviet army, accounted for 75% of the combat fighting power. They destroyed 75% of the combat power of the greatest army ever fielded in human history, the Wehrmacht. It was the Soviets that won that war. You can say what you like. I think it's indisputable. They destroyed the fighting combat power. Now, they paid for it. Over 11 million Soviet soldiers died. But they were well aware of this. This uncomfortable alliance that they'd formed to defeat the Nazis, it was over. The Russians had arrived in Berlin. What are we going to do about the Russians? It's very famously, Patton said, let's turn around and use the remaining Germans to chase them to Moscow. This is General Patton, the great general. He wanted to turn the Allied and German armies around and fight the Soviets. So this was a signal. And the Dresden attack was a signal. And people know this. That's why it's been very covertly erased. And it was actually Maria Zakharova, the Russian foreign ministry spokesperson, who came out and condemned this as unacceptable, right? So she condemns it. The British take it completely silent. The Americans say completely silent, and the Germans come up with some excuse that a trainee sandblasted it by accident. It doesn't look like an accident to me, but it all fits into this same narrative that, you know, once now that Russia's the enemy again, for some reason. I mean, Russia's only done what America has done dozens of times, what Britain has done probably hundreds of times. That's all Russia's done, is to intervene to protect its people. This is the Russian position. We protected our people. We warned you not to stimulate this wasp's nest on our border. You did. And now you're reaping the consequences. And terrifyingly for the West, their only weapon to try and stop Russia, because they can't defeat them militarily, it's an absolute fantasy, which just won't happen without all of NATO facing off against Russia. And even in that case, China could join Russia, and we've got World War III, and nobody wants that. No one's sane. Some people in Latvia, Lithuania, but then again, sanity up there is in rare supply. So when you consider all this, it's all feeding into a narrative to sterilize the Allied political impact in Germany post-war. And remember, what the American mission was in Germany was to keep the Russians out, keep the Germans down, and keep the Americans in. And it's exactly what's happened. Drop Nord Stream into the mix. This arterial lifeline of cheap, reliable, absolutely high-quality Russian gas into the engine of the European economy, Germany, with its engineering, with its auto industry, with its manufacturing power, cut off, destroyed. A perfect opportunity to cut off Germany, who had warm relations with Russia post-war. After the end of the Second World War, most Germans accepted that it was the Russians who sacrificed most of freedom from Nazism, as in France, as in Britain. Take that poll again in 4 years ago, and all of those countries think their own countries contributed most to the defeat of Nazism. It's remarkable. And this is all part of a sterilizing process by client media. Remember, the same people who own and operate the media, the editorial power of the client media, as I call them now, not the mainstream media, the client media, because they predate on the same funding for advertising and contracts from the centralized US intelligence community via the US government and the British government for compliance. That's what you get. You comply, this, if you notice the narrative, the term Russia's totally unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it appeared over a 1-week period a year ago in all legacy client media. That doesn't happen by accident. I mean, this is the way. If you own the rule book, you write the rules, you pay the people who challenge the rules, you're paying the referee, because that's meant to be the media, the free media. The free media in America used to ask questions. Remember Watergate? Remember Vietnam? Remember John Kerry standing up and saying, who are you going to ask to be the last man to die in Vietnam? There used to be an inquiring media in the United States. And now it's down to people like you, Patrick, people like Max Blumenthal, Aaron Mate, these great people who decide we have to speak out, we have to speak up, because this machine that is an integral part of the war machine, the justification of war, the licensing of war, the demonization of the enemy, as in the Palestinians, it's all an integral machine. And erasing history is a key part of that as well, Patrick. And that's what we've seen, I think, in Dresden.
No, absolutely. There's even an element of this. I wouldn't even discount, Shay, that Germany taking their official government stance of genocide denial regarding the ICJ South African case in The Hague. That's the official German position, as is the official Canadian position, the U.S. position, and the British as well. This kind of inconvenient narratives from history, the firebombing of Dresden, gratuitous carpet bombing of a non-strategic city, for what reason other than just complete domination and a type of a genocide of sorts, at least in that confined area. Looking at Gaza, this is a huge embarrassment. This is what you see, Shay, with authoritarian regimes in histories, this sandblasting of history.
Yeah, it's a very good pun, really, because they literally sandblasting history. Another interesting one. I was a big World War II geek back in the day. I collected a lot, I read a lot, I studied it. On D-Day, the Allied Air Force killed 12,000 civilians in the first 3 days in their bombing of the D-Day beaches and the Cannes region. 12,000 French civilians were killed. It's not a number most people would know. You see, people just don't want to look below the surface. So it's like, we were fighting a terrible power. So these were all sacrifices which were made in the contribution to that. Okay. So it's this illogical dismissal of human life. I mean, it doesn't count when you're on the wrong side of history. And so this is what they're trying to do. They're trying to recalibrate history as an absolute truth, that there's no way you can challenge it. You can't challenge the fact that you can't go beyond October 7th. You can't go beyond October 22nd. It's this absolutism. We can't go and ask, what, does the, great expansion west in the Americas, what does it all mean? How do we get to where we are? Because we don't understand the past and we can't model the future from the past and say, well, come on, look, we've learned from this. And we've had American lawmakers and even staffers in the White House coming out in the State Department writing an open letter at the start of saying, bombing Palestine, attacking Palestine isn't going to work. I'm an Irishman. I remember as a kid, a young boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, watching the news of what was happening in the country and watching British soldiers beating people, the RUC, the UDR, what they were doing to the people in the north. And I remember feeling myself, as soon as I can, I'm going to join the IRA. I mean, naively, I was a kid. This was an ambition. I thought, I'm going to join the IRA and I'm going to show those bastards. And this is the terrible frustration we felt in Ireland, in the South particularly. The Southern government stood back and allowed the British basically to do as it wanted because it was warned. You intervene here. I mean, there were plans for an intervention by the Irish Army, which is tiny. It's not even an army. It's basically a militia. No air force, no armor. It would have had no impact other than to maybe bring in the United Nations. Mm-hmm. But of course, because it was Britain, there would never have been a United Nations intervention on Britain's doorstep, on its own territory. They would have never allowed it. So the Irish would have been wiped out, as they were. There were pogroms against Catholic Irish in the north. This what led to this idea that there could be an intervention from our side in the south, which had this free state status, basically. It was a republic, but it was very much reliant on Britain economically and etc. So it was a very complicated situation. It's a bit like Fatah and Hamas in the West Bank. In Gaza, excuse me. So when we see all this, how they're mixed in, you just got to understand, as long as the United States and Britain control, number one, the narrative, number two, the rule book, I don't believe, sadly, that there's going to be any conviction made against Israel in the ICJ. I just don't think it's possible to happen. I'd be absolutely astounded if Israel is convicted of any crime or there's any judgment made against Israel. I will, eat my hat. Now, I get it wrong. We all get it wrong. And I would be delighted to have got it wrong. But I don't believe for a moment that an institution, which has basically been and proven itself to be NATO's legal firm in the past, I find it very difficult to believe that NATO's law firm is going to now, admonish a key ally in the Middle East, which polices the dysfunction created by the same people now steaming their great warships into the region, telling the world they're going to fix the problems they created probably hundreds of years ago, Patrick. I just don't believe it.
Well, we hope, at the very least, if that judgment doesn't come down the road, that South Africa's provisional move to get an emergency measures. I personally, Shay, I think the moment South Africa stood up and laid that out in front of the world without any interruptions on a global forum, that's never happened before against Israel.
Yeah. That's wonderful to see.
Yeah. It's powerful. It's really powerful. So we live in hope that some good might come of it. But I share your skepticism, of course, of everything in The Hague as being a tool of Western hegemony, basically. Look, I think we're going to wrap this segment up. Shay, I know you've gone a little bit. You've given us some extra time here. We very much appreciate it.
Always a pleasure.
I speak on behalf of our audience as well. Chay Bowes, international journalist based in Russia. Shay, give us a shout out of how people can find out and see more of your work.
Yeah, well, my Twitter is probably what I use most. It's at Bowes. We also have a news site called The Islander Reports, me and Jerry Nolan, and that's growing on Telegram. It's kind of big. We try to do more analysis, long form stuff, and a bit of humor as well. We're also looking for interest and stuff. So if anyone wants to find us on The Islander. the link to the website's on my Twitter page, and my Twitter's at Bowes Shay.
Yeah, we're retweeting the Islander at 21 Wire as well. So you can link all that through Shay's Twitter account, or X Twitter.
Oh, yeah.
Formerly known as Twitter. You can find all that there. So Shay's producing a lot, also doing some great work with RT. His archive there is incredible. So you can follow him. He's very, very busy and very, very much on the pulse of what's happening geopolitically. So I do recommend following Shay. Thank you very much, Shay, for joining us on the Sunday Wire Live this week.
Thanks, Patrick.
There he goes, ladies and gentlemen. That is Chay Bowes.